we look in the life of Jesus, right, is his death brought about the forgiveness of sins, and is the forgiveness of sins brought about the redemption, the reconciliation, the resurrection of Jesus. And so if you're looking to see resurrected purpose and resurrected relationships in your life, it's going to be preceded by forgiveness. Hey, welcome back to the Daron Earlewine podcast. We're walking through each chapter of the Death of a Dream book. So excited about the progress that we're making. We're up to chapter 15 today, and it's a doozy. Let's just be honest and say that one. And so we're gonna get into the weeds, the deep waters here for this episode. And I just want to take a minute here right off the bat and thank you so much for being a part of this podcast community. It means so much to journey with you, to hear the stories from you about what God's doing in and through your lives. And I want to thank you that have joined us as financial partners here on the podcast, that have given to Blackbird Mission, our nonprofit, to help us continue this work. Back on Giving Tuesday, many of you joined us, and it means the world. If you still want to be a part of that, or maybe be a part of a year-end giving opportunity, you can do so at blackbirdmission.com/give. And it is a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit, and this helps us to continue to spread this word, to awaken people to become what they were born to be. And I just want to thank you for your partnership and what we're doing. And we're going to jump in right now and talk about forgiveness. Chapter 15 in the book, and from page 129, it says this: one of the greatest obstacles to maturing into the weight of our calling is forgiveness. It's true. It just is. When we go through the death of a dream, usually there's one of three people involved, if not all three, that we struggle to forgive. First and foremost, there's oftentimes somebody else that has betrayed us in some ways, that has hurt us in some ways, that has broken our trust in some way, and they have contributed greatly to the death of our dream. There's someone else that needs to be forgiven. Sometimes the death of our dream comes at our own hands. We've somehow self-sabotaged our own dream. We've killed it ourselves. And so there's a part of forgiveness for ourselves that has to happen. And then there's an interesting one that I think is probably present in either scenario. And it's probably theologically wrong, but it's emotionally correct, is that oftentimes we've got to forgive God, where he's not done what we think he should have done. And one of the things that's a barrier to us growing in trust is to let that go. And it's not really forgiving him because he hasn't sinned against us, but I think you understand what I'm saying is coming to a place where you let go of whatever resentment or pain or a lack of trust that you're holding against God for not doing it the way that you wanted him to. We're going to look through that as we go through this episode, and I hope you're blessed by it and then encourages you. The beatitude that speaks to this one in the book is chapter 5 of Matthew still, verse 9. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. Man, if that's not a picture of the story of Joseph through this book, I don't know what is. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. What we see in Joseph's family of origin is everything competing and fighting. And not until the forgiveness that Joseph is able to actually extend to them do we see a place where there's actually some type of peace that comes in to the family. And how is that available? Well, because Joseph has discovered who he really was in his place in God's family. And God's will for your life and my life is always reconciliation. It's always redemption. That's the direction that God's taking us. And forgiveness is going to be the gateway that we experience that through. The reality is forgiveness always precedes resurrection. If we look in the life of Jesus, right, is his death brought about the forgiveness of sins, and is the forgiveness of sins brought about the redemption, the reconciliation, the resurrection of Jesus. And so if you're looking to see resurrected purpose and resurrected relationships in your life, it's going to be preceded by forgiveness. And that's some heavy lifting, bottom line. Because as I say in page 132, it's so much easier to wallow in self-pity and anger, blaming the person who hurt you, than it is to trust the unbeaten path of forgiving those who have hurt you. But as page 33 says, if you're not careful, you'll find yourself continually harvesting the pain of your past instead of reaping the sweet fruit of God's faithfulness. That's true, but it is not easy, especially when we have things that lead us to remember our dreams. In the book, in the story of Joseph, right, is his brothers. What happens, right? He leads he leads Egypt through this time of 7 years of plenty, and then there's 7 years of famine. And Joseph leads the country through that. They've got all the food stored up they need so that they'll have food for 7 years. He's done an amazing job leading them. And then his brothers come to get food because they hear there's food in Egypt, and they come before him. And as Joseph sees his brothers, the Bible says, and then Joseph remembered his dreams. And I mean, just think about that moment for him. Like, here he is now, older in age, has had all these life experience, all the stuff that he's gone through and experienced. And then here are his brothers again. And as he sees them, it triggers this memory, and he remembers his dream. And I don't know about you, but if you've had the death of a dream like I have, there are probably certain environments that trigger you to remember your dream. And it's in those moments that if we have not walked the path and chosen forgiveness, that all hell breaks loose. For me, this may sound foolish, but I write about it in the book, but tour buses are my triggering moment. Whenever I'm driving around anywhere and I see a tour bus, I always say, there's a tour bus. It drives my wife crazy, but I mean, I almost wreck the car sometimes by like trying to see the tour buses, because part of my old dream, I always wanted to freaking travel in a tour bus. I still never done it. Like I say in the book, God and I have a little bit of a side deal. I think maybe someday it's going to come around. Woven, not wasted, God. It's in the book. Come on, let's get a tour bus in the mix. But when I see them, and I'm better now than I was 10, 15 years ago, but I would see tour buses and I'd be like, man, that's how my life was supposed to be. When I would remember my dreams as I would be triggered by these tour buses, I'd get angry, I'd get mad, I'd get full of resentment. And it led to unhealthy things, and it wasn't leading to a redemption of purpose. And I don't know what it is for you. It might be something more grand than a tour bus, but you had a dream and it died somehow. Somebody was involved in that. Maybe you or maybe it was them. Maybe it was the both of you. But you see something and you remember your dream. I can remember talking to some young ladies at one of the churches that I've led that talk about their dream is always to be a mom. And they talk about hearing birth announcements, or people talking, celebrating getting pregnant, or Mother's Day, major triggering moment where they remember their dreams. For you, maybe it's a loved one that's passed, and it's going by that park where you guys used to hang out, or by the football field, or by your grandma's house, or for you, if it's a job thing. Maybe it's seeing a commercial from that job, or maybe you've always dreamed of going to college, and when you walk by the campus, or you see, I don't know. My guess is if you could talk through the podcast to me, which I would love for you to, you can always reach out to me, email me, Daron@blackbirdmission.com. Would love to hear what are some of your triggering moments, but you have them. You get triggered, you remember your dream, and then it's like, what do I do now? And if you haven't walked the process of forgiveness, that's going to be the first place to start. And one of the things I think is difficult about these triggering moments, and they may last forever or not forever, for a lot longer than you initially forgave someone. And so one of the things I talk about in the book and what I had to experience in my own life is I had to come to a place and pretty early on where I forgave, in the initial kind of death of my dream, I forgave the person in the situation was involved in that. And actually, the first time I forgave him was pretty immediate, like within the first few months, because I realized that holding on to bitterness was not going to serve me or anyone else well. But the reality is I had to remind myself for probably the next decade, I still forgive them, right? I forgave you, forgiven. There we go. There's the certificate of forgiveness. I have forgiven you. I release you from the debt you owe me. I see a tour bus. Wait, I don't. I want to punch them in the face. Nope. I still forgive them. And here's the reality. You may have to remind yourself that you still forgive yourself or you still forgive them hundreds and hundreds of times. That doesn't mean that you don't mean it every single time. It means you're human, and it means you have emotions, and it means you're in process of healing. The problem is when you get triggered by something and you remember your dreams and you don't follow through to say, I still forgive them. There's a great story in the New Testament where Peter is talking to Jesus, all right? And he comes to Jesus, and let's see where we are here. We're in Matthew 18, 12 through 35 in the New Living Translation. Peter comes to Jesus. Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Which 7 would be like the kind of like the perfect number or the biblical number. So like Peter thinks he's really going over the top with this, right? Like, geez, if somebody wrongs me, I mean, I'm really going to go holy here 7 times. I mean, top shelf here, Jesus. 7 times. Then Jesus says, no, not 7 times. And I'd like to believe there was a pretty good pause here. Like sometimes we just read the Bible too quickly, right? And in this space, I'm sure Peter and the rest of the disciples had to be freaking out. Like, because when Peter says 7, they're like, oh, Peter went with 7. Like, what's Jesus going to say now? And then Jesus goes, no, not 7 times. But 70 times 7, which this had to absolutely blow the disciples' mind. What are you talking about? We should forgive someone 70 times 7 times. Jesus goes on to tell this story. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with his servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. But the man fell down before the master and begged, please be patient with me and I'll pay it all. Then the master was filled with pity for him and released him and forgave his debt. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few thousand dollars. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me and I'll pay it. He pleaded, but his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. Then the king called in the man he had forgiven and said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. That's what my heavenly Father will do if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. You see, what Jesus is saying here is when we get to our triggering moments, where we remember our dreams, when we're getting stuck back in what ifs, what if this is not fair, what if? When that happens, what's your focal point? Is your focal point how you've been wronged and how this was unfair, fill in the blank of all these things? Or is your focal point the faithfulness and forgiveness of God? And Jesus' story is saying, listen, we're going to do the math here. For me, the holy God, to forgive you and welcome you by grace into this relationship where I'm with you, I'm for you, I'm not against you, what I've created you on purpose for, all these things that you've been promised, this covenant relationship. If I've forgiven the millions, I'm going to need you to embrace and extend the same thing that you've received. So when we remember our dreams, we have to remember our forgiveness. Without it, we will not experience the resurrection of our purpose. I think for Joseph, that had to be where he was at, that his focal point was on the faithfulness of God, not the unfaithfulness of his brothers. I'm sure there were times when Joseph's sitting in prison where he had to have some bad days, right? Where he's triggered, he's sitting there, he's in a prison, who knows what's going on with his brothers. He goes back and thinks about it, and he has to be like, you know what, if I ever get a chance, if I see those guys, they're in trouble. But something happened in the meanwhile where Joseph chose forgiveness, and it actually led to the transformation of his character, so that when he was able to step into the moment where he could have brought revenge upon the people that had ruined his life, quote unquote, he extends forgiveness because his focus was on the faithfulness of God, not on the unfaithfulness of man. And I want to encourage you to dive into that. Whether you got to spend some time journaling, spend some time in counseling, spend some time discussing it as a group, is when you remember your dreams, your focus has to be on the faithfulness of God, the forgiveness of God, the trustworthiness of God. It cannot be on the unfaithfulness of people. What can happen in that process, as we talk about the resurrection of purpose, is that you actually are able to move past how your micro story has been hurt to see how God is actually bringing resurrection of purpose in his macro story. We've talked about this before, but we see this in Joseph's life. I love this chapter, and I love this chapter in the Bible as we look at it in Genesis 45. Joseph's brothers, they're there, and he can't take it anymore, so he sends everybody out of the room, and he says, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Stop. Are you kidding me? Think about this moment. These guys thought he was dead. They had no idea where he was. And he pulls them close and goes, hey, guys, it's me, Joseph. The one, remember the guy's life that you completely ruined? Oh, yeah, you're in my country now. I'm second in command. This is probably the moment you die. This has to be what his brothers are thinking. Listen what he says. Hey, listen, guys, don't be distressed. Don't be angry. How much forgiveness and grace is flowing from Joseph right here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. The macro purposes of God. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and no reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household and ruler of Egypt. Wherever you find yourself today, what matters most is that you know that forgiveness is a process. As you process your grief and own the journey of healing from the death of a dream, helpful survival skills are allowing compassion for yourself and giving yourself generous grace. The journey towards forgiveness is a road paved with grace. Grace for yourself as you heal, grace from God as you heal, grace for others as you heal, grace for your denial, grace for your anger, grace for your bargaining, grace for your depression, grace for your acceptance, grace for your not knowing where to go or what to do next. In this process, grace is best understood. I love this. Grace is best understood as presence. God's grace doesn't just forgive us, cancel our debts, and reconnect relationship with him. Grace invites us in and keeps us connected to the presence of God. I see it like a cycle of grace and forgiveness. God's grace ushers us into the cycle. It is grace that allows us to experience forgiveness of God. Then grace shifts and reveals his presence. Then God's grace is us in us, gives us the power and presence we need to heal and to be made ready to forgive. It is God's presence that empowers us to make the decision to forgive. And once we have forgiven, we are more able to be in the presence of those we are forgiving. From page 140 in the book. And I want to put up a little graphic here that kind of sees how this whole kind of, think of like an infinity symbol, kind of weaving in and out. And we didn't have any pictures in the book. If we had pictures in the book, I'd have put this picture in the book. So maybe if we do a reprint of the book, we'll throw this in the book. But what we can put it up here on the screen. You can see it. This idea that as we grow in this understanding of grace, right? See it as like an infinity sign. And we've got the grace that comes from God, right? Brings us into forgiveness from God, which brings us into the presence of God. As we go through the presence of God, it actually gives us the power we need to forgive others, which brings us back up to experience more grace from God, more presence from God, to experience the more of the power of God that we need for courage, for healing, to love, to redeem. And this cycle goes over and over and over again. Forgiveness from God, presence with God, to extend the love and the power of God to others. That's the loop that we need to get into when we are triggered and we remember our dreams, because our resurrection is impossible without forgiveness. Deep stuff today. Man, this is so key. This is so key to our growth, to our resurrection. And the good news is that God can help us do it. Forgiveness is the pathway into what is, into what could be. I want to hit you with another scripture, and then we'll wrap it up today. Okay, Ephesians 4:30-32 in the New Living Translation. Paul says this, "And do not bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way you live. Remember, he has identified you as his own, guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption." Right? You're forgiven. So he says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. There it is again. When we have these moments where we've forgiven and we need to maybe forgive again, the focal point comes back to what we have received. We can forgive them, we can forgive ourselves, and in some ways we can even forgive God and say, God, I want to have peace with you again, and step into this kind of relationship. I'm not saying, like I said, theologically that's incorrect. I'm just saying emotionally that's so true for so many of us. Listen, if today is the day for you to step into that forgiveness for the first time, don't wait. It is your next step. If you've done that years ago, but you're in an environment, you're in a season right now where you just keep remembering the dreams, choose it again and again, 70 times, 7 times, because it's as you put yourself in this grace and redemption and this forgiveness loop that you prepare yourself for the resurrection of your purpose. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daron Earlewine podcast. Would love to hear from you. Know how we can pray for you, help you walk this journey. Until that time, never forget, God is for you, not against you. He's near you. He's not far away. And he's created you on purpose and for a purpose. Talk to you guys next time, right here, the Daron Earlewine podcast.